Wonderful, thank you so much. Good evening and warm welcome to our panel discussion, Who Owns the Museum? Post-Colonial Ownership and Cooperation in the Era of Globalization. Matthias already mentioned there's two occasions for this panel discussion. So there's this exhibition here at Lenbachhaus, Group Dynamics, which we had the pleasure to visit today. I can highly recommend it for anybody who hasn't seen it yet. Please go and see it. And the second occasion is a publication that was published by Goethe-Institut with a multitude of partners, with a multitude of contributors, called, now I have the German edition, but it's called Museum Futures. And you can, if you are interested, you can download it for free at the editor Turian Kant, or you can also buy the book. But it's a compilation of perspectives on the museum from South Asia, Africa, and South America, and it has a lot of very interesting perspectives. And some of the contributors are tonight with us, and will certainly delve into a lot of questions that have been raised with this publication. Yes, my name is Julian Fuchs. I'm the head of culture programs South America at the Goethe-Institut Sao Paulo, and with me are an amazing set of panelists. To my right is Flower Manase. You are a senior curator of history at the National Museum of Tanzania with a bachelor degree in history and archaeology, and you're currently engaged in provenance research of colonial collections in Germany, connected to the Ethnological Museum in Berlin and the collections in Tanzania, mostly the Museum and House of Culture in Dar es Salaam. Luiza Proença, she's on the right. Luiza is a transdisciplinary researcher, writer, and curator, originally from Sao Paulo, and currently Luiza is a societal, communal-based work fellow at the Akademie Schloss Solitude in Stuttgart. And Luiza was involved in quite a lot of different projects, among them Bauhaus Imaginista, that was also a show at Haus der Kulturen der Welt. We have Shuddabrata Sengupta with us. Shudda is an artist and a curator with the Rax Media Collective in Delhi. And we have Chao, Tayiana, Maina. Chao is a Kenyan digital heritage specialist and digital humanities scholar working at the intersection of culture and technology. And among many things, you're the founder of African Digital Heritage and a co-founder of the Museum of British Colonialism and the Open Restitution Africa project. So happy to have you here with us tonight. Maybe some words on the setup of this discussion. We have about 90 minutes, I think. And we'll start with some inputs from our panelists. We'll engage in a conversation here. And then we also open it up for questions or remarks from you. So we're really happy to get your ideas. In the audience, there are also some of the contributors or editors, actually. Latita is in the audience, who is one of the editors, as well as Luiza, part of the panel. Excellent. Maybe let's start with a question. You all have very diverse professional backgrounds, and I think it would be interesting to hear what connects your work with museums, and maybe what kind of potential you see in museums, if you see any. It could also be an answer. Flower, would you like to start?
Okay. Good evening. As I'm introduced, I'm working at the National Museum of Tanzania, so definitely I'm already into museum job and activities. So to me, I started working at the museum as a curator, and ever since I've been maintaining the same position. And my connection to the museum has been drawing closely to the history of Tanzania, and particularly the history of independence. So I have built all of my interest in knowing how we were getting the independence, especially the Tanzanian part within the region of East Africa, because in East Africa, we have this history that Tanzania was the first to get independence, but when you look back into the history, there is a lot to start there. So my connection within the history itself and my work has been connected again with the degree that I took at the university. So all these are so connected. I can say my connection in my work and the job is also connected into the education. So that's what I can say for now.
Wonderful, thank you. Luiza, what's your connection to museums and what potential do you see for museums?
Well, before everything, thank you I'm very glad and happy to be here. It's my first time in Munich, and also with this amazing group who are also part of the authors of the book that I co-edited with Memory, Leonard, and Latika. And Latika did the most amazing, intense editorial work, so thank you very much. And I hope you can find the book soon in the bookshops, because I really think it's a good book, bringing very diverse perspectives on possible futures of museums, but also bringing very specific issues. So not only like national state museums, but also communal museums, etc. Well, this question about my relation with museums, it brings in my memory several events that I experienced in museums as a visitor or also as working for museums. So I think that I could answer this question in such different ways. It's very complicated to me to choose one thing, but I have a few things that I would like to share just to start, and maybe this will be more philosophical rather than pragmatic way. Yeah. So I need to go on. The first thing that maybe I would like to just share to introduce is also part of the question of this panel, who owns the museum? And then I was thinking that this concept of ownership or property is also very much a capitalist and colonial one. Like, for instance, the indigenous ways of knowing in South America are not equivalent with these property-based regimes. So I also would like to start with just share this short testimonial, an excerpt in this book by David Kopenawa, who is a very known shaman from the Yanomami people in Brazil in the Amazon. And in his book, The Fallen Sky, which is an amazing book that I really recommend, there is a translation in English, maybe there is a translation in German. He describes his experience in a museum, and I will read, and then we can continue the discussion. So he says, another time, I was taken to visit a vast house to which the white people gave the name of museum. This is a place where they lock up traces of ancestors of the people of the forest who disappeared long time ago. They are spirit goods. Yet, these images of the forest people, ancestors, so long confined in these distant houses, can no longer dance for us. We cannot make their words to be heard in the forest anymore, for their paths have been cut off for too long. In the din of their cities, the white people do not know how to dream with the spirits. So this is my first contribution.
Thank you very much, Luiza. Shudda, what connects you to museums, and what potential would you see for a museum?
Hi, thank you very much, Julian. It's lovely to be here, and I'd like to say a special word of thanks to Leonard, who should have been here with us, to Latika and to Luiza for making this wonderful book possible. I think any of you who are visitors to museums or work in museums will find it very rewarding, because it brings together both what I think is the pragmatic as well as the philosophical question of what our attachments to museums are. So speaking for my relationship, I work as part of a collective. It was wonderful to see this show today, so it was like seeing our ancestors, the collectives of the modern period. And as part of our collective practice often works with archival and historical traces, so we usually enter museums from the back entrance, which go into the archives, into the storage, and that's where we make our most the discoveries that change us in our practice. And I remember, for instance, that in a museum in Athens not so long ago, since we are close to the Glyptothek, it's, Greece is not far, we discovered a drinking cup from a shipwreck. It's called the Antikythera Shipwreck, and there's a clockwork mechanism that's very famous. But this humble drinking cup had on it the word Pamphilos, which means the friend of all. And that began a process for us of thinking about the nature of what is it to be a friend of all. So the museum opens up that possibility. I mean, we now tend to think of see museums as sometimes as conservative spaces, but they were actually in their inception and origin very radical, because they made possible kind of an unanchoring of objects from their specific histories to join a radically universal conversation of humanity. I mean, there's many difficult and violent contexts to that, but still remains the possibility of understanding and entering in dialogue with the unknown. So this Pamphilos cup then became an engine for the staging of conversations about life and precarity and what the future could be within the museum. And that's, for me, the most interesting thing about museums, is that they're actually, we think of them as spaces of the past, but we could also think of them as anticipations of possible futures. And so with that, I'll just read a few of the 21 declarations that are a part of my contribution to this book. There are 21 declarations about the Museum of the Future. The Museum of the Future will be a philosophical playground. The Museum of the Future will be a theater for the rehearsal of unrealizable historical propositions. The Museum of the Future will be a crime scene perpetually under investigation. The Museum of the Future will be a workshop for the repair of broken inquiries. The Museum of the Future will be a garage for unlikely transports between ages. The Museum of the Future will be a warehouse for the storage of unresolved questions. It will be a terminus where the trams from tomorrow will arrive on time today. The Museum of the Future will be a spaceship for journeys into inner space and outer time. It will be an agora where solitude will be exchanged for solidarity. It will be a hospice where dated concepts will go to leave the world in peace. It will be a clubhouse for retired civilizing missions. It will be a studio for those who don't yet know that they are artists. I think that's one of the most beautiful things about the Blaureiter exhibition, is that some of the people in that exhibition didn't know yet that they were going to be artists. But they became so. The museum made them so. It will be a hideout for fugitive good ideas, a hothouse for the cultivation of rare life forms of the mind, and so on. To read the rest, I encourage you to purchase a copy of the book.
You left out one of my favorite, which is the Museum of the Future will be a penitentiary for cultural arrogances. Wow. What connects you to museums, and what potentials do you see in museums?
I mean, I would say that first and foremost, it's amazing to be here. I've traveled all the way from Nairobi, and to join you in person after 2 years of endless Zoom calls is really, is really a pleasure. My connection to the museum really starts with my childhood. I think the first museum I ever knew was my grandparents' home. My grandfather has things on the wall that remind him of his career and his Paris and his time in civil service. And my grandmother has items on the wall alongside cultural items, jewelry, and much more. And so as a child, I knew that the things that connect you to the past are also things that you can live with. They're things that can gather dust, and you can touch them, and sometimes you can wear them, and sometimes when you're playing, you can break them. Now, for me, I did not think of that as a museum in the sense of the museum that we know now. But I look back, And I understand that for me, the first thing that I knew was a museum is a living space. It's a space that is lived in, and that carries with it the lived experience. In my present day life, I work as a digital heritage specialist, and I look at the connections between culture and museums and technology. And so while I do not work exactly in the museum, I sit on the periphery of the museum. And sometimes I'm like the annoying neighbor who's always knocking on the door and asking to come in. And sometimes I'm welcome and sometimes I'm not. But in this job of kind of digital thinking and digital technologies, I also see myself as a translator, as a medium between different worlds, the technical world, the cultural space. And so I find myself having to speak two languages and to understand two worlds, with the kind of pleasure of upholding the dignity of both the technology and the museum as well. And so in my attempt to speak these two languages, I push very much for the innovation of the museum, what it could be as a space, what it could be as something that does not exist in space as well. By this I mean, what does a museum without objects look like? What does a museum without a physical building look like? And can we really call it a museum? And so I sit here to talk about museum futures, but sometimes I think when we speak so much about the future, who is it for? Are we designing this hypothetical museum for our children and their children, or are we designing it for ourselves? And when does it move from being the idea of the museum of the future to something that I can see in my lifetime, and I hope that I see? And so, in as much as I'm here to talk about museum futures, I'd love also to think about museum presence and what it means to exist today and to kind of implement the changes that we're talking about in these discussions.
Thank you. Yeah, this is actually where I would like to go next, to talk a bit about the museum of the presence, or also where's the problem with museums. And I think we all come from contexts where we see that the museum, or some of the older concepts start to be inadequate in a way. Looking a bit on a European or a German context, it would be, we have this artificial divide between high art and ethnographic art. We have the colonial context of most of the collections of so-called ethnographic art. There's the question of how audience are reached, how communities are being involved. So there's a lot of questions. Looking at your context or museum concept you're familiar with, what would be like your analysis of the status quo? And maybe Flower, I read your text on the shift because there was an acknowledgement of being not adequate anymore. Maybe you could tell us what the analysis was.
Thank you. As I said, being employed at the National Museum of Tanzania, I'm happy that I joined the team while the museum was transforming. And as I said, our museum is one of inherited colonial institution. So initially the museum was not created for the people in Tanzania, but rather serving for information and direction for the colonial administration and officials who were coming to Tanzania. So when you want to understand the genesis of the National Museum of Tanzania, you have to compare it also with the archives, the National Archives. So you find all these district books that were recorded at the time were really, their intention was to collect the materials either for research or for administration or for understanding the local people who were living at that time in those locations. So the museum itself, we had the idea of having the museum started during the German colonial time. During Hans Meyer Foundation, he wanted to put the museum for geological collections and ethnographic collections, but it didn't materialize due to World War I. So later the British colonial agency, I can say, who were also in Kenya, they took over Tanganyika as a trusteeship territory, and it's when now the first museum came into process. So if you look at the National Museum of Tanzania, the model is exactly with the museum in Uganda where the British were, and also in Kenya. So these collections which were in East Africa, they were kind of segregative, and they were feeding in the British colonial desires. So for our museum to start transforming, it all started as the museum geographical location itself was not welcoming to the local people. So we see that the museum, as you compare it with the ICOM Code of Ethics, it's supposed to be for the public. But this museum, as it was inherited, it was not for the public within that specific time, especially after independence. So the people who were working in the museum soon after independence, they wanted first, the government itself, they wanted to change the museum to support independence movement. And not only the independence movement, because when I'm saying independence movement, Tanzania really contributed to the liberation of other Southern African countries. So at that time, first the propaganda for, they knew that the colonial master was using the museum for propaganda, so they wanted to adopt the model, also to make the community really understand the culture, but not only that, to show the people that now we are going to Africanize. So for us, we have the policy, which was the Ujamaa policy for Africanization, where everything needs to belong to the Africans and the people who are living there. So this was the beginning of transformation at the National Museum of Tanzania. So first was to accept the museum was there as a change. This is like, now we have to accept we have King George Memorial Museum, which is the first to be built by the British. But then what next? Because people are not coming. The museum is placed within the first location that was identified with the Germans as the botanical garden. And when the British came, they said, no, this should not be a botanical garden. It should have some of the museum premises, the first parliament building there. And it's so close to the State House. So if you look at this museum, it's a white building where local people, they don't go inside, they feel like it's a government building. So how to break the mental colonial, I can say these are mental ideas that were, people lived with them from colonial time to independence. So the idea was to build a new thing, a new museum. And the new museum in Tanzania, it started with the structures, because the museum that existed, the structure itself was not welcoming. So we built, or the director who was there together with other stakeholders, and when I say stakeholders, I mean the community, the people who are living surrounding the museum, including the schools. They welcome these groups to brainstorm what they want. So people contributed in these meetings saying, if we come to the museum, what they wanted to see. So most of the people, they started to share the ideas, what they wanted to find in the museums. And this is what brought about the museum and the House of Culture. This is a place where people are welcome to come and experience the culture. And not only experience, but they have to feel, because these stakeholders, while they were coming at first to the museum, they felt like they were misrepresented, because the exhibition they were exhibited in a comparison, like this cultural group against this cultural group. So if it's a female, is compared against another female from another ethnicity, the way they dress, the way they eat, the way they prepare food. So you see that all these racist ideologies, they were also within the premises in this area that were used to be the colonies. So for me, I feel like the idea of the Museum of the Future, within that context of 2,000 years when these changes started in Dar es Salaam, first they had to come up with the buildings. Second, they had to identify who is public. And third, they had to employ curators who are the locals, because at that time there is this Eurocentric idea that only a curator who is coming from renowned institution with this experience could curate. So at that time, if you were just coming from school, people ask you, what kind of exhibition have you curated? what is the experience. And now they had to give chance. And I'm happy I'm within the first group of people who were employed into this museum and house of culture in 2009. Until present, we have been there. So they really recruited students who were within the university to come and learn. So we started to learn and to do research within this museum. So I feel like all these changes and trying to include the people within the community, and these people, you give them job, first of all. And you help them to know the museum, and for them now to start working against the power and the structure which is there. So the Museum of the Future in Tanzania is also about the system, changing the system, and it's what we are doing now, I can say.
Thank you. Shudda, I think in the pre-talk you said you are, I'm paraphrasing or citing, you're interested in breaking up the consensus of the museum. Could you tell us a bit more? What is the consensus, and why does it need to be broken up?
Sure. I come from a city and a country where museums are intensely political sites. In India right now, current political disputes often refer back to things that happened 300 years ago or 600 years ago or 1500 years ago. They inform current affairs. There's a joke that says that what used to be current affairs is now history, and what used to be history is now current affairs. It's not so different from what happened in this country, where museums and culture became intensely politicized in the 1930s. There are very similar processes, similar obsessions and concerns about the purification of Aryan culture. These are words that you know. They happen right now in India, and they influence museums. At the same time, there's also a certain difficulty in conceiving of what the nature of a museum in a republican society like India is. So while the cultural apparatus of the Indian Republic underwent certain symbolic transformations, it did not sufficiently distance itself from the imperial cultural project of the British Empire. So let's say if we take a look at the National Museum in Delhi, where the city that I live in, the core collection of the National Museum and the site on which it was founded was actually what used to be called, from the 1930s onwards, the Central Asian Antiquities Museum, which was basically built to house the objects taken without any consent or permission by a Hungarian explorer called Orelstein from Chinese Turkestan, from the famous Dunhuang caves, and which became the core collection of the National Museum. Now, this is a very interesting process because there is a claim being made by the Indian Republic of a greater Indic civilizational story which extends right up to Chinese Turkestan. It's an inheritance from a British legacy of plunder, which the Indian Republic now claims as its own, and which the Chinese government could one day ask for repatriation, with the further complication of the fact that Chinese Turkestan is itself, in a sense, a colonial occupation. So you have three layers of cultural politics. You have an Indian Republican museum that claims objects from Chinese Turkestan, which it took as inheritance from British imperial plunder. You have Chinese government which controls Chinese Turkestan in a sort of colonial way, but which could ask for repatriation. And you have the secret of the fact that the Indian National Museum as a project is built on this idea of Pan-Asian fantasy, which was a British fantasy, which has been now taken by its Indian legatees. So the politics of museum making, museum perception. So that's why I like to go with my colleagues into the basements and the storage rooms, because there you get the stories that no one tells you, right? You have to make the stories up for yourselves. And I see museums, therefore, as kind of like, in the same way as one would see geological fault lines. It's where tectonic plates meet and often collide with each other, producing energies that are unstable and that can erupt at any moment without any anticipation. So my task as a cultural practitioner, as an artist, as an intellectual, is to spot these fault lines and to alert us as a public, whether here or in Delhi or in wherever else or in the Humboldt Forum, that museums are not stable spaces. They are extremely volatile, unstable, geological collision spaces, and let's be aware of that fact.
Chao, with your project African Digital Heritage, you're also responding to an inadequacy of memory and museums in Kenya, right? Would you like to elaborate a bit on that, where you see the shortcomings?
I mean, the shortcomings of the museum are many. And Flower has really touched on them. But I think we also need to talk about the kind of context in which the museum is formed. Because the context of the European Museum and its formation and its origins are very different from the context of the museum in Kenya, for instance, or the museum in Tanzania. And for us, I think it starts with a deep, deep recognition that the museum in itself is a site that is embedded with a very deep kind of violence, that we are now left with a job of either trying to ignore or to rebuild. And so this violence for me is a very crucial point, because it speaks to an inherent distrust that many indigenous people, many people on the African continent have for the museum. It is not that people are not interested in history. It is not that people do not have any inkling or perception of culture. I think it is that the museum is a space that has represented, one, as Shudda says, the point of disruption, and two, the very fact that this disruption came with a lot of violence. And so when we think about artifacts and we think about objects, we also have to remember that these objects were not taken as historical objects. They were taken as living objects. They were taken from homes, they were taken from shrines, they were taken from religious spaces and community spaces as well. And so when we talk about what the museum represents, we also have to think about what it misses in its representation. And so what we are seeing, for example, in Kenya, especially through digital mediums and technologies, is that there is a higher interest in cultural and historical information online than there is in the museum. People are more likely to be in dialogue, to critique, to engage with historical content on Twitter, on Facebook, than they are to go to the National Museum of Kenya in Nairobi. And I think we really need to, what I try to do in my work is to pay attention to this, because it's not just a matter of the accessibility. And yes, access is a thing, the ease of access online is a thing, but I think it also speaks to a kind of freedom that exists outside the walls of the museum, outside the building or the structure that it represents. Many of the collections that we still have, or permanent collections, are still collections from the colonial period. And so the ways in which people are described, the kind of language that we are, how do I say this? The kind of language that we ingest, even in the physical space of the museum, is a separation. So I will go and find something about this. This is a, let me say, this is a Maasai pen. That's it. and because this is the entirety of the complexity of the colonial kind of encounter, in which the collector says, I will just name the object and I will name the community. That is all there is to know. And so we have school children who will visit the museums and will think, it's just a pen, you know? There's nothing about it that is complex. There's nothing about it that is interesting. There's nothing about how it was used, who made it, what it was made of, where it was taken from. And what digital technologies are giving us is an opportunity to add layers of meaning and layers of complexity to data that was simplified and stripped of its significance. Of course, we will not get to the point where we can talk about a spiritual, a cultural object in all the layers it represents, but there is a freedom in digital media that exists in the physical space. And this is clear in the work that we're doing in Kenya, as well as I had the pleasure of working with Flower in a project last year. And so what digital technologies represent for us specifically as African museums and African cultural practitioners is a freedom to exist outside the limitations of the museum. It's a freedom to imagine, to reimagine, to disrupt, and to actually walk away from the descriptions. We can actually say, you know what, we're not even focusing on the terminologies that are used. We're going to come up with an entirely different system. And so the setbacks or the gaps that we have in the museum today are not things that, for me, hold me down. Like, I do understand that, yes, these museums are very bureaucratic and sometimes can be very slow, but at the same time, I feel that we have to challenge ourselves to exist outside the space of the museum and the physical in a way.
Luiza, I will not ask you the same question because you cited Davi Kopenau before, which was, I think, already a very strong testimony of the shortcomings of the museum. Maybe let's talk a bit about how to ways out or positive examples. And I think some of the contributions that you gathered from South America are very much so amazing examples. Thinking of Elvira, director of the MUSEV, the Museum of Ethnography and Folklore in La Paz, who herself, as an indigenous background, sort of puts the museum on its head and changes a lot of things. Or also Asevu Jelage, would you like to elaborate on one of these examples that sort of are counterpoints to the classical concept of a museum?
Sure. Just a brief comment, because I love the idea of this the geological collision or disruption, because I also have maybe this, always think about this, my nonsense idea of a museological unconscious and how we can access it. Because somehow if we think about the future, we have to reveal the past, and so we have to dig in this unconscious of the museum, and maybe put the museum under like really clinical psychoanalytical analysis. And I am always wondering, how could we do that? So I think it's the same thing as you do going to the backstage, the backstage also as this unknown agent of the museum. And regarding this specific case, I would say, from Elvira Espejo in La Paz, I think she did a brilliant work. She has been doing a brilliant work there, which is absolutely inspiring for me, because of course, as I brought also this quote by Kopenau, because I'm always participating in discussion about the museums removing this agency of objects, of the animism of the objects, and contributing to this division of object, subject, which is the same as culture, nature, right? And I think that right now there is some interesting discussions, for instance, around the climate change, about how to bring to the fore and enlarge our our political circle, bringing to the fore these agents like atmospheric phenomena, virus, things that are really affecting us, which also are non-humans, not only the large human communities, but also, and I think that Elvira did this somehow, recognizing. So, as you said, she came from, she has an indigenous background. She came from a very small village in Bolivia, and then she became the first indigenous director of this museum. And she's also an artist, a poet, a weaver. I like also this idea that director is so many things. Last year she did this video clip with a rap singer in La Paz, which is also amazing. And then she always told the story that when the museum is a nation-state museum, and so with an archaeological collection, very much ethnographic. And when she arrived, she tells that she found when she was visiting the collection, she realized that those objects were like shouting, like, I am language, I am culture, I am, like they were really protesting, and I am a being. And then she decided to reorganize the whole collection, which was divided, as we know, the museums really used to do different groups, very also formalist approach of the objects. And she reorganized through the way that the objects, in the case, the objects that which also consider as subjects in their original context. So people drew, like for instance, a piece of textile, and at the end, this textile is also a familiar, someone who belongs to the community, and who was born as a person and can die as well. And so she decided to reorganize the collection through the process of manufacturing this object, which I think it's brilliant, because then you also preserve the know-how, how to do this, because this is what we are also missing in our societies, how to produce things, because we buy things already made. So she really recovers and working really very closer to the communities. So trying to recover the way that they take the raw material from the land, and then how do they process that material until the end. And the museum really shows this whole process, like for the very beginning to the contact with the first raw materials until the final person object in the museum. So it's really interesting, and she has been doing this very closer also to the people, that makes this object. So this is why it's a very good example.
Chao, maybe talking a bit more about, we're discussing a bit the status quo of the museum. We're discussing about how to get away from that, maybe in forms of digital projects. But oftentimes there are still the challenges, right? There's the power structures remain, like in the digital world, you still have capitalist power structures. If you look at the big content producers that, of course, also compete for attention, and other challenges remain. If we think about global cooperation, maybe that's going a bit beyond, but climate change and so on. So there's a lot of, even though we want to leave the former ways of doing, there still remain a lot of challenges that are situated in the presence. Maybe looking first at the digital and the competition in the digital.
No, the digital space does not exist without its faults, as we've all come to see, not just in heritage, but in many other spaces as well. One of the things that, we have significant challenges. Yeah, we have challenges around skill. We have the kind of skill that is required to exist in digital spaces from a museum perspective. We have infrastructure challenges. We have funding challenges. And I'm not even getting to the challenges of just trying to take on Facebook and Twitter and all these conglomerates, which highly likely that we don't have the capacity to. At the same time, I think that the challenges will always exist. The barriers of access that technology presents in terms of reaching audiences, in terms of existing in different places and encountering different worlds, have been significantly lowered with digital technology. what we are trying to do now, both in Kenya and with other African partners, is not just to take on technology as a one-size-fits-all. I think the real danger in terms of implementing digital projects exists with kind of accepting that technology will serve everyone equally, which it will not. So what we are saying and what we are trying to implement, albeit with the challenges that I've mentioned, is the idea that we also have to critique technology. We have to critique the structures of it. So when we are looking at, for example, things like metadata structures, how objects are described, yeah? What we have in kind of global standards, which are really westernized standards, are descriptors that focus on the materiality of the object or the artifact, its measurement, its height, its weight, its number. But what if we were able to come up with our own metadata structures? Lisa was just talking about knowledge and skill. How can metadata, the way we describe items on our website, the way we search for it on Google, how can it change how we encounter culture, how we encounter objects, how we describe people even in the metadata collections? So what we're trying to say is that in as much as we do have this kind of push and pull, for me it's not really about whether the challenges should exist or not, it's whether we can push through what we can with the challenges that will always be there. It's a hard task, I will not lie, in terms of uptake, in terms of getting people to even just understand that technology is something worth investing in. But I think the mistake, and one mistake that people make, is to feel that technology and digital and physical worlds and spaces exist separately, that they're mutually exclusive. What I like to propose is to envision digital and physical spaces as complementing each other, as being part of the same cycle where something moves from the digital world into the physical, from the physical into the digital, and how do we establish that life cycle in a way that centers the culture and pays respect to it. We have several practitioners who are challenging and really pushing back against digital structures as well. Temio Dumosu, who is a scholar on technology and the kind of afterlives of digital technology, has spent a lot of time in Danish archives, reviewing records, archival records from the period of slavery in the Caribbean. And what she argues is that we do not also have to digitize everything as it appears in museum provenance and other records that we see. If there is material, for example, that is insensitive, that is hateful, that is biased, we also have the obligation as cultural practitioners to counter or stop this material from existing in digital spaces in the way that it exists in the physical space as well. And so technology really is not about giving the power to the technology, it's about remembering that we as human beings, as cultural practitioners, are also making decisions that are leading the technology, not vice versa. Just because the camera is there doesn't mean that we're going to use the camera to take a photograph of everything. We are making decisions. We are actively, consciously making decisions on what will exist online, how it will exist, where it will exist. And the decision-making process is a human process. The curatorial process is a human process, even in the digital space. And so within this kind of push and pull, it's also about remembering, one, our decision-making power, but also what is the humanity that we embed in these technical processes as well. Yeah.
We're soon opening up for questions, so if you have questions, you can already form them in your head. Shudda, I still remember the talk we had earlier. We talked about fake news and political polarization, and I'm thinking. I always think that there's also a need for institutions. There's not always a need for more uncertainty, but sometimes also a need for consensus, or somewhere to fall back, maybe as a society to have to not get lost in this postmodernist spectrum of of uncertainties. How do we, if we break the consensus of museums, do we need a new consensus, or how can we also, thinking of fake news, thinking of neo-nationalist movements, can the museum as an institution also be a bulwark against that in a way?
Well, I think museums change people, but people also change museums. In the sense that what happens to an object when it reaches a museum is a story full of unpredictabilities. In the essay that my contribution to the book, there's a little fragment about, let's say, what are called Chola Bronzers, which are these spectacular bronze icons of the god Shiva, for instance, which in the Indian context, the people who made those icons were not then allowed to see them because they were often from lower artisanal castes. And then seeing the object would be to cast a shadow on it. There's a wonderful poem by a Tamil poet of the medieval period where he says he went to see the icon he had carved, and the story is that he dissolved himself into it. So he no longer existed as a human being, he became a part of the icon. Now that, for me, that's a tragic story. It's not a story that I celebrate. For me, what's interesting is that the National Museum in Delhi today, anyone who walks in, especially in a country like India, which has caste as a consistent problem, a person who is not authorized to see the icon changes the icon by looking at the icon. And when they leave the museum, they leave transformed as someone who is now able to see something that they were not able to see. So institutions have unexpectedly radical consequences, right? I mean, these were not necessarily the consequences that were the design of the museum, but they become the life of the museum. One of the most remarkable pieces of writing on art that I know is by the Russian war correspondent Vasily Grossman, who accompanied the armies that came into Poland and so on. And he has this remarkable report on Treblinka. But a few years after, he has an essay called The Return of the Sistine Madonna by Raphael. And it was taken from a German underground bunker where a museum had stored it by soldiers of the Red Army with great reverence, taken to Russia, made war booty and exhibited. And in 1956, for some unknown reason, the Soviet state decided to return it to the GDR, to Dresden, I think, from where it was taken. Now, when it was going to go away, there's a period of time where people can come and bid farewell to the Sistine Madonna. And he describes being a witness to that moment of farewell. And he says that in the face of the Madonna and the Christ, he's a Jewish man, has no relationship to the Christian tradition, he can see the entire history of the world ending with Treblinka, where he has been. Now, Raphael did not create this image for this moment. It was not placed in a museum in Dresden for this moment. It was not even taken to Leningrad for this moment. But the moment became possible because of the intersection between the institution of a museum, the space and time of contemplation, and what it does to people. So that's what I think is the real function, the unpredictabilities that institutional certainties can sometimes produce. In German literature, you have Peter Weiss, I think, who wrote this trilogy of novels, The Aesthetics of Resistance, and it begins with the first chapter is a group of workers looking at a painting and talking about themselves, their lives, and their history. Nobody predicts these possibilities, but they happen.
I'm wondering, Luiza, maybe we should reveal or talk a bit more about one of the community museums, because we haven't talked about Acevo de Laje yet, and José Eduardo is not with us today, but you know him well, and you know also the space well.
this is another specific case of the book. José Eduardo, I called him Ginho, sorry. José Eduardo and Vilma, they wrote for the book, and they spoke last week in Bayreuth. And you can also see their presentation online, I think. But yeah, they created, actually it's not exactly a museum, it's a collection in the periphery of Salvador, which was the first capital of Brazil. And the land where their collection is located is also a place where many historical events happened in the past, like since the first contact of the European invaders with the indigenous people until several revolts of the black slaves and the colonial and their colonial owners and so on. And so yeah, and then they are in the very much in a peripheral neighborhood, and they created this collection in their house. They started in their living room. And now they have a second house because the collection started to grow very much. And this was 2013, 2012 maybe. And yeah, and they became what we call a community museum, although they don't call themselves a museum, with artworks, objects from artists and maybe even non-artists of the neighborhood, trying to really find, like, I don't know, a painting that was inside a bar of someone that was completely forgotten. And then they were really recovering these stories and material production, cultural material production of the neighborhood. And also collecting, and this is one of the things that I also like very much, collecting also a lot of natural matter around their houses, like shells and or like tiles. They take the tiles that the ocean brings from the center city to the periphery, so they really are like seeds. So they are working with a very wide notion of what a collection could be, but always thinking what is important to preserve inside the community. And another thing that they said was really nice, that you, of course it's a museum community, and then you can touch in everything, you can relate to the objects in a different way. And yeah, I think that also one of the most brilliant phrases that Eduardo said last week was like, we want museums of life. We don't want museums of death anymore. So, and they are located in a very violent neighborhood. So they want the museum to inspire people, to force them to, and vitality, not taking their energy and their life is, no. So this, I think, is something really relevant. Anything else that I should?
No, and his formula actually is quite. It's very accessible. It's not that very complicated. He says like we have to do education programs for children, for instance, and really gets the whole community involved. And the institution is also now, or it's becoming more and more connected in Brazil, and even having an effect beyond Salvador, which is very interesting.
Yeah, but actually I feel a little bit bad, because when I'm speaking in English sometimes I cannot find the right word, and I feel like responsible because it's such an amazing project that I would like to share in a proper way. So yeah, read the text please, because it's really amazing, their own perspectives.
Maybe because the House of Culture and the Museum of House of Culture in Tanzania, you after this change, you also managed to or you changed also the way of how to interacting with the community. And would you like to elaborate a bit on your strategies in that regard?
Yeah, I feel like that is one of our main challenge at the moment, because the question of the Museum of the Future in 21st century is all centered the attention to the community and the public. And again, the National Museum is still within this framework with all these changes as the House of Culture, but we are still locked into the colonial framework, because the collection, as Chao said, the collections which are there were taken or were collected during the colonial time. They don't have information, and also the history is not written properly. So when you are about to make the exhibition, you have to rewrite again the narratives. But who are you writing for? Because the idea of the public, again, back to my country, is so divided. You might bring in the artist for intervention, but there is these creators of this object who also have a say to this exhibition. So I'm feeling like, as a curator, now where we are going to become a center for community. And this is the idea of bringing the community to the museum, meaning that the curators are no longer going to decide what to display, what to narrate, because the objects which are there, they have the creators. The creators, they have their own stories. And even if the creators are no longer living into the present time, they have their grandchildren who could have something to say to the object. So I feel like the museum and the House of Culture, first of all, as the National Museum, we are dealing with the change of the change of the structure, creating new systems and bringing in the community to decision. So this is a bit bureaucratic because it's a government institution and it's also a political one, but this is what we are doing now. And our strategic plan is all dedicated to the community. Again, it's derived within the political nature where the government now wants the museum to become a tourist center and not necessarily a cultural heritage center. So it's not a place where you just come for research. We also want to earn money. So this is the government idea, and there is the museum idea. And also there is our community needs. How are we going to balance that? So I feel like this is the beginning of the change, and there is a lot to work on. And the community should be the center, as everyone is saying, of everything that is happening. Because at the end, these are the creators of the objects that are within the museums.
I think Christine Litz, one of the contributors to the publication, who's museum director in Freiburg, I'm not sure right now, but she sort of describes it that the museum has to develop from a dining room and has to become a kitchen. So people are not just going there and expect a good lunch and they don't want to know anything about the lunch, but they maybe go and join and partake. And I thought that's an interesting metaphor. Wonderful.
Yeah, I have also maybe a question for you. I don't know exactly if I can formulate. No, but I think that there are several perspectives and contributions in the book. Wondering the museum as like a minor institution, more fragile, processual, dynamic, connected to the bodies, connected to the communities. And somehow I feel that there is a resistance, because power doesn't want to lose this control, because it's too processual, it's too dynamic, it's too affective. So how do you do with that? I don't know, it's really difficult because it's very challenging being inside the museum and trying to do the changes that you're doing, and I really admire that.
Yeah, so. Thank you so much for that question. I think the change also, for me, the way I perceive it, it comes with age. There are this group of young people who don't care what power says about. And there is this group of people who are used to things be the way they were. So when I feel like as the museum, the management is doing change in a strategic move. When they want change, they bring the youth and young people front. And sometimes instead of them saying, they bring also the group of artists to say the things, or the students to curate, to do some programs. So when we report this, they are coming not necessarily from the museum management, but through the other channels. But again, as I said, we know that these institutions, they are also the work of some people who have been there for so long. And we were speaking with Chao just before coming in. And these people, they feel like whatever that is happening within those structures is still good, but time has changed, and there is a need to do these changes. So I feel like, first, the youth, they are real upfront for the change, because when they come to the museum, they dare to write within the comments book that we hate this. So it's really interesting. And there is this situation in our museum where the students who were visiting, they broke the piece of art which was in the exhibition. And when they were called with their teacher to explain what really happened, they were like, we thought we should touch and it fall down, but it's not that much important because it has this so and so policy which we don't feel like it belongs to our time. So like in Tanzania, there are some youth who are against Ujamaa, like they felt like Ujamaa was nonsense. And they are now speaking on Twitter, speaking on Facebook. People, they are feeling okay to tweet whatever that is happening at the museum. So we receive also critics from this group. So the way to solve our problem is to bring in for them to comment now. So that's how it's then the message to the power. But again, the ministry, I feel like it's also changing as through elections, people are coming, people are going. So the people who might be problematic into the top official level, they might not necessarily last for long. So there is also those dynamics with the changes.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you for the question. I mean, I encourage you also, if you have questions regarding each other's work. We also have a bit tragic text by Marcelo Rezende, who was sort of writing about the National Museum in Rio de Janeiro, which burned down, was victim of a big fire in 2018. And there, it's probably also the change, or it was too late to change it because of negligence and so on. And then sometimes it has this radical, he writes it also a bit cathartic, if I read him correctly. But of course, I mean, catastrophe like that is always a catastrophe, first of all. Any other comments or questions?
I think I just wanted to respond to what Flower said. So Flower and I, we sit here as young women who work in the cultural space, yeah? It's important for us to also recognize where we are in time. So for example, if the podium there is the colonial point in time, the disruption, and you are my grandfather, and Flower is my mom, and I am me. So the closer you are to that point in time, the more you respond both to the traumas and the power dynamics and the power structures that you are closest to. And what Flower is illustrating so beautifully is that also the farther away you go, in a way, it's also a kind of freedom to exist outside. What will people say, and how do we respond to the museum, and what if I break this, you know? I think about the quote from one Toni Morrison who says, racism is a distraction. And I think also about Wanuri Kahyu, who says that, who would we be if we were not responding to colonialism? Like, who would I be if I did not have to, I as Chao, in my 20s, have to take on this whole wide subject? I could just be myself, you know? And so the freedom to move away from that point in time also comes with a different perspective. It comes with courage, in a way, to stand against that, but also an indifference to the power structures and what they represent. So I think it's also hopeful that we are existing in a time where we have generations that are not tied to the idea that they have to respond to the colonial encounter as the center of their being. You know, they can just exist as they are, and they can be free to imagine as they are. So we are doing the labor. Unfortunately, I'm still quite close. Whether it's a curse or a blessing to be at the stage where we also have to interpret and work through explaining this to our peers and to those who will come after us. But I think time in itself is it heals. And the work we're doing, we may not see it exactly manifest in this radical way. Hopefully we will, but I do think it's not a matter of if, it's really when this happens. Yeah.
Then we can look forward to Shudda's and Luiza's generation. Wonderful. We're already coming to the end. Thank you so much for the discussion, Flower, Chao, Shudda, Luiza. I enjoyed it a lot. Thank you so much to the Lenbachhaus, Matthias and Karin for the cooperation, for my colleagues from Goethe-Institut, Lukas, Markus, and Carla. And if you want to, if this was just increasing your appetite for more, I can again recommend you to download for free the digital publication. There's a lot of things that we haven't covered tonight, and I think there's very interesting essays and thoughts. Thank you so much, and have a good night.